Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Estonia for our historical regions series. Like for Finland, last time it's important to start a bit from before, right, given a bit more context, right, and appreciating the coming together of this country over the ages. The name Estonia is a good starting point because it occurs, as you know, first in a form of aisti, right? So this ancient people described by the Roman historian Tacitus in his treatise De Origine et Situ Germanorum, and the passage chapter 45 goes accordingly. Upon the right of the Swabian Sea, the Estian nations reside, who use the same customs and attire with the Swabians. Their language more resembles that of Britain. They worship the mother of the gods as the characteristic of their national superstition. They wear the image of wild boars, which were domesticated historically in ancient Estonia. This alone serves them for arms. This is the safeguard of all, and by this every worshipper of the goddess is secured even amidst his foes. These are somehow evidently chthonic, female, right, cults, right, and they differ substantially in this from, for example, from most Germans. Rare amongst them is the use of weapons of iron, but frequent that of clubs. In producing of grain and the other fruits of the earth, they labor with more assiduity and patience than is suitable to the usual laziness of Germans. This refers specifically that, again, to this sort of chthonic lifestyle, right? The Germans, like the Celts, etc., described in classical sources as they were actually mostly peasants and agricultures, but right, the idea is that the true warrior, right, the one that wins and enslaves and rules, etc., has somebody else, in fact, working for him, right? So now I will not digress further in what Tacitus means exactly by this, but this is the difference that is posed here. So that the Estians were a people that were mostly just, as you imagine, trying to survive out there without much of a social stratification. Surely had been emerging from the Bronze Age, right, in which they, according to this statement, would have still been, right, at least because rare is the use of iron, so at least, well, they were into it, right, but they couldn't afford too much of that. In any case, Tacitus goes on and says, "Nay, they even search the deep, and of all the rest are the only people who gather amber." This is very important, as we will see. The Amber Road was pretty much alive at the time from the Baltic to the Italian peninsula, and we will see it in a later passage by Cassiodorus, right, reporting a letter of Theodoric to the Estians, in fact. They call it glezum and find it amongst the shallows and upon the very shore, but according to the ordinary incuriosity and ignorance of barbarians, they have neither learned nor do they inquire what is its nature, or from what cause it is produced. In truth, it lay long neglected amongst the other gross discharges of the sea, till from our luxury it gained a name and value. To themselves it is of no use. They gather it rough, they expose it in pieces, coarse and unpolished, and for it we receive a price with wonder. There would be a lot of comments to make, because it's very interesting, but we have to move on specifically here. The name of Aisti, or Esti by that point, may have indicated Baltic tribes living in the area as well, not just the Finns, that, as you know, are, at least by language, these peoples. In the Scandinavian sagas, we're talking about the 9th century specifically, the term Estians started to be used to indicate the, say, what we call the Estonians eventually as the people that had been consolidating throughout the years. Ptolemy, in his geography, third in the middle of the 2nd century AD, mentions the Osilians among other dwellers on the Baltic shores, and as we will see, this name of the Osilians or Zelians, whatever, is a historical name for the people who, prior to the Northern Crusades in the 19th century, lived specifically in the Estonian island of Saaremaa, that is Ösel, and that carried out actually through expeditions, so much that were called practically the Estonian Vikings, right up to places like Sigtuna in the heart of Sweden, and creating problems also for the later invaders of Estonia. As we will see, that chapter is very overlooked to a degree, because there were differences between the Estonians, as we will see now. They hadn't quite compacted already as a single people in antiquity, and or at least they were still substantially divided. Some were very continental, others were very maritime, right? So there were Germanic influences from the continent. Generally speaking, those who lived on the coast traded mostly with the surroundings, mostly through sea, while the others received mostly an influence from the south, inland, right? Surely the Roman age does bring some, of course, as we've seen said by Tacitus, substantial influence in the land. Amber is exported. We find Roman coins, some jewelry and artifacts dating from the time in Estonia, and of course, as we will see now better, the Estonians were pretty aware, right, of the say, faraway peoples, as we tend to overlook dramatically just because they wouldn't write, right? That's not a good indicator, and it's forbidden to make moral relativism regarding these indicators, in fact. But of course, this doesn't mean that there wasn't mobility or communications, as we've mostly been told, and especially about the Middle Ages, but it was if in the ancient world it had been easier, etc. In any case, what is mostly fascinating is the account from the 6th century Roman historian Cassiodorus, who basically reports a letter that was sent by the Ostrogothic king of Italy, Theodoric, at the time of this, in fact, Roman-Germanic coexistence, and a moment actually of great centrality of the peninsula, especially among the central, even the northern Europeans, as we will see here, because there was this axis that was countering the Merovingian Byzantine one at the time, while the Goths, as Arians in Italy and in Spain, were also supported by the central European pagans that feared, especially to be conquered by the Merovingians at that point. So Theodoric is famous for his very far-reaching relations, right? Matrimonial alliances, political influence, and prestige. So here we can read this passage from the Divarie of Cassiodorus that shows us the Ostrogothic monarch addressing the Esti. And it says like this: it is gratifying to us to know that you have heard of our fame and have sent ambassadors who have passed through so many strange nations to seek our friendship. We have received the amber which you have sent us. You say that you gathered this lightest of all substances from the shores of Ocean, but how it comes thither you know not. But as an author named Cornelius Tacitus informs us, this is beautiful because they were quoting the previous source, it is gathered in the innermost island of the Ocean, being formed originally of the juice of a tree, whence its name Succinum. and gradually hardened by the heat of the sun. Thus it becomes an exuded metal, a transparent softness, sometimes blushing with the color of saffron, sometimes glowing with flame-like clearness, then gilding down to the margin of sea and further purified by the rolling of the tides, it is at length transported to your shores to be cast upon them. We have thought it better to point this out to you, lest you should imagine that your supposed secrets have escaped our knowledge. We sent you some presents by our ambassadors, and shall be glad to receive further visits from you by the road which you have thus opened up, and to show you future favors. Right. So this is incredibly fascinating, because it just not makes, let's say, of course, clear how, in contact Italy and Estonia were at the time, but how also Theodoric, supported by this classical civilization still running in his country, and referring to the same Tacitus describing the matter of the Aesti that were allegedly ignorant, at least of the broader natural philosophical causes of amber, etc. Essentially shows off and says, well, thank you for having heard of us being so important and having representated, by the way, this trade, and that eventually had been shattered during the migration era, and so was reactivated at different points through this farm, because the Amber Road literally began in Estonia and ended in northern Italy. That was the route, right, across Central Europe, where, as we've seen, were so many strange people. This is interesting also how the gods would see other peoples that lived in Central Europe, and this trade relation is kept open, and the same Estonians have essentially searched for it, right? Unfortunately, we do not know about the extent of the Estonian territory in early medieval times with precision, right? Things are relatively disputed, but at least the nature of their beliefs overall is not, right? They were known to the Scandinavians as experts in wind magic, as were the Lapps, right, that were known at the time as the Finns, right? The Sami. I made a video about medieval Finland that tells you how, of course, things had proceeded in that northern region. That is very very close, as you understand, culturally to the same Estonia, and there are other peoples, at least called, like, we do not understand exactly who they are, etc. But the Chuds, for example, or Chud, right? That is a term at least historically applied in the early East Slavic annals to several Finnic peoples in the area of what is today Estonia and Karelia, right, and also northwestern Russia, right. Here, say the details are also philological in nature, because naturally we don't have much ground tags for saying who was who archaeologically, as always, right. But it's still important to appreciate the fact that different cultures looked at the Ests or Estonians at this point and fundamentally acknowledged them as such. In the first centuries AD, political and administrative subdivisions probably established themselves in Estonia to remain the basis of the country's, the historical country's district, right? First of all, in scale, there were two subdivisions, one inferior to the other. The parish, as it would be known later with the spread of Christianity, that is the kihelkond, and the county, the maakond, right? So the parish consisted of several villages, and barely any parish lacked a fortress. And there had been substantial works, right, of defense with interesting, hilltop fortifications, but some traditional fashion, but also with a bit more of stone here and there. In fact, there are very, very interesting finds, some of which can still be observed in open air. Let's say that, of course, the country had witnessed fortified settlements such as Asva and Ridala on the island of Saaremaa and Iru in north of the country during the Bronze Age. We have fortresses, of course, dating to the Iron Age, but used in some cases temporarily. In any case, over time, right, social stratification, the migration era, like the increasing need also of protecting themselves from the sea, something we have seen also across the Gulf of Finland. In fact, for the other northern country, that also reflected social compaction. That's why you have this political and administrative subdivisions emerging more clearly, archaeologically, and essentially to overlap for the later historical evidence, of course, of a pre-existing. The defense of the local district was directed naturally by a leader, right, a parish elder, usually, so essentially elected by the villagers, while the county was composed of several parishes and also headed by a greater leader, right? So by the 13th century, you have the major historical counties of Estonia already developed. You have Saaremaa, that is the Auxilia, right? Essentially the largest island of Estonia, and several smaller islands near it, such as Muhu, Ruunu, Abruka, Vilsandi, etc. Then Läänemaa, I will, by the way, butcher the pronunciation, of course, located in the west of Estonia, and known as Rotalia or Maritima, because these are the Latin names, right, given to it, because they, of course, were facing just Saaremaa, right, and it was a very strategical land because it controlled the straits and was somehow more exposed than the hinterland to, as we were saying, naval issue. Then you have Revala, so the Revalia with the town of Reval, that is today's Tallinn in the north on the Gulf of Finland, right? Then Virumaa, Vironia in the northeast, Järvemaa in the central part of the country, known as Järpia, Sakala, and Ugandi, Ugaunia in the south, right? As we will see, there were clashes also with the southern neighbors. At some point, the old Lithuanians came to raid the same Saaremaa, right? And as we will see, we'll have a pretty tormented history, both offensively and defensively, and also, as we were noticing, loaded in strategic relevance because of the location. In fact, it was fortified from an early age, and acting a bit as a shield and as a launch pad for Estonian raids around, even though the Germanics had the upper hand in the Baltic at that point. There is the beautiful Varbola stronghold that is a testament to the robustness, right, of the fortresses could be edified. At this point, it was one of the largest circular rampart citadels and trading centers built in the land during essentially the Iron Age, right? And the remains are striking. They show you the degree also of it's inland, right? It's in a continental area, which tells you also how, of course, there was a seigneurial, territorial need of control of the local population, etc., with a substantial amount of stone you can still see at its place, fixed by tree logs. And considering the scarcity of surplus in the general area, I talked about, the region, if I'm not wrong, looking at the outskirts of the steppes, even though we are relatively far from them. But, there were influences, were raids, etc. And again, considering the primitive character of these cultures, still the resources invested for war are impressive. Right, the same can be said for Finland, as there are really similarities for this. So the Viking era is also an interesting phase because there have been, if I'm not wrong, in a place known as some finds of actual Estonian Viking ships. We know, as we were saying before, that from Saaremaa there were, from multiple sagas, we know that. Not specifically about Saaremaa, but still about the Estonian Vikings and their exploit offensively up to Sweden. There were some famous leaders killed in the fight against these peoples. And of course, this is a bit like the case for the entire southern shores of the Baltic. This can be said for the Vents. We will surely cover this. Because they weren't just, say, Scandinavian Vikings, and therefore, of course, piracy is a pretty universal activity that you can find among these populations are not even dramatically different. Scandinavia is surely framed within a already kind of more robust type of political and social development, of power concentration, more similarly to, say, Western Europe. So they had the upper hand, right? The Vikings hit these places hard. It was always basically the same picture, like trying to dislodge them from the coastlines and pushing them back in the hinterland. It was, however, so wild and savage that nobody really it wouldn't really make any sense to venture in to, and so aside from the riverways that were all bit around the countries, and so with an interesting political and strategical role that the Estonians could play in the picture, mostly have this interland natives being pretty aggressive and pretty hateful against the invaders, legitimately, and this thing would go on and on and on. Historically, we will see St. George's Night massacre in the 14th century, when the Germans, in that case, and the Scandinavians were seen as properly the invaders and were massacred with incredible ferocity without any compromise. And this represents a bit just like the struggle you see during the Northern Crusades, but it had started during the Viking era, right? You do not need Christianity to do that. That just reinforces it and makes you do it better, more orderly. But the dynamics are pretty much the same. You would be surprised, to know what actually happened, even though it's not documented during ancient times. The dynamics were pretty similar, and still the locals were forced to be reckoned with, because also the invaders coming from the surrounding lands didn't have an enormous power in the first place, so keeping under all these various Estonian counties, especially the ones from the hinterland, but also trying to dislodge this pirate nest from Saaremaa and other coastal fortresses was definitely an hardly fought enterprise, right? For an East Baltic world that, as we've seen, was already substantially militarized, right? So with these conquests, especially as we will see now in the later centuries of the late Middle Ages, you see essentially the Livs, the Lets, the Estonians, then the Prussians and the Finns defeated. Right, that's what happened. We've seen it in the history of Finland. We've seen it, for rather Baltic interland. Right, you have baptism, military occupation, and sometimes extermination by groups of Germans, Danes, and Swedes. and the brutality of this theater was, I think, hardly second to anyone, right? What happened here, like, was again a faraway front, right, populated by pagans that, even when forcibly converted, would maintain this primordial hatred as peoples, right, against the invaders, and that would continuously be reminded of their, of their role through steel and all the kind of vexations that you can imagine. But it was a colonial land, right? This is definitely an episode of firm, at least, installation of external lordships that were based properly on the concept that they were superior. That was the case, right? They were superior to the locals. They had forced them down in arms, and they had earned the rule over them. Because at some point they gave up, or at least the embers kept burning under the ashes, but there was not much they could do to some extent. So Estonia was one of the last corners of medieval Europe to be Christianized in the process. Let's remember that Lithuania is just south, and that would remain pagan until the 14th century, which is exactly the one of the aforementioned kind of rebellion of the Estonians, and that had some pagan undertones, right? Paganism here wasn't a matter of tougher, principle of resistance in the name of paganism. It was simply because they were conquered by foreign people that was not, say, also dramatically capable of molding, if not on the very long term, these populations into some firmer obedience. And of course, if those had been Christians who were launching crusade like the Livonian one against this Finns, this Balts, well, the obvious banner under which to rally was the one of paganism in a broader sense, and the level of pure, I don't even know how to define the level of violence that was reached, like by both sides, is like the clearest manifestation of the fact this was just a bitter struggle for the most elementary reasons of mankind. And there was a lot going on. There were some Estonians, of course, joining the Livonian order, the Teutonic ones. So everything was also very hybrid in nature. It depended on the usual mechanisms of cooptation, of, say, convenience, right? So there was nothing just so categorically outlined. In 1193, Pope Celestine III called for a crusade against the pagans in Northern Europe, right? And the Northern Crusades from Northern Germany established the stronghold of Riga in modern Latvia. That would be, from that side, in fact, the main center, right? So with the help of the newly converted local tribes of Leves and Lets, the Crusaders eventually initiate the raids into part, at least, of what is present-day Estonia. We are in 1208. If you think about it, very early in time, and especially in certain countries like, again, Central, Northern Europe. Remember that what's the difference here between a Danish crusader and a Viking pirate? Right, of course, there are deep differences for those time standards, but they're doing exactly the same thing, right? And the level, again, of sheer traumatic brutality displayed by is beyond words. The Estonian tribes fiercely resisted the attacks from Riga, was the power base of the Crusaders, and occasionally, of course, themselves sacked territories controlled by the Crusaders. By land, by sea, or both, of course, because say you have, if you look at the geography of it, you have the Gulf of Riga, right, with the city in the lower end, the southern end, and then Estonia is fundamentally develops in the north, right, of that, and the Gulf is closed by the Osa, as we've seen, the Saaremaa, and the center also what would be established as the Danish Duchy of Estonia was in far north, with Reval / Tallinn, right, and some dioceses were established significantly between in the straits, right, between the Osa and the Duchy, right. There were others, such as the one of Dorpat in the east, with the border at the border with the Like Papes, Pskov, that belonged to the Republic of Novgorod. You know that Narva is basically the at the border between Novgorod and Estonia. So, as we've seen also in the video about medieval Finland, the eastern frontier would become also a frontier with the Slavs, and there was all a process of national consolidation under, say, the Scandinavian rule that that entailed this very long-term kind of understanding of the advantages deriving from cooperation in this broader competition, but it mostly has to do with the modern age, so we don't digress too much on it today, right? In 1217, the German crusading order of the Sword Brethren, right, and their recently converted allies won a major clash in which the Estonian commander Lembitu was killed, right? He was from the Sakala county, right, and he is essentially the only Estonian pre-crusade ruler about whom some bibliographical information is known, right? Because the Livonian Chronicle of Henry, this work about, say, the late and the early 13th century, written, in fact, in around like 1229 by a priest named Henry, tells us of this guy, because otherwise, say, Estonian warfare is quite telling of the scarcity of certification. There are very interesting matches that we see here and there. I made a video about the tactics of the Baltic Crusade when the Teutonic Knights had to levy some Estonian auxiliaries, and they were so infantry relying that because they didn't have much surplus to have a much more of a solid cavalry, at least to the qualitative degree that collective training that was necessary, especially to face the charge of German knights that were at the peak of their moral and technical capacity in that century, brought to the Teutonic Knights that had definitely a few knights anyway, to rely also on some infantry tactics that allow us to document one of the earliest evidence of infantry wings in European warfare that likely was normal, becoming pretty standard in the 13th century throughout the entire continent, that, however, we can document well, mostly just in countries like Italy and others with not just great infantry development, but also a substantial, much higher degree of documentation. But this is fascinating anyway, because it shows you how the cooperation with the invaders happened, right? From the first time, of course, the Estonians were fighting against one another on a regular basis in their tribal warfare, so there was surely a cooperative, pro-German, say, party and pro-crusading party, and still a pro-pagan one of independence, in a way. And, say, the degree of political cohesion and identity recognition of the Estonians here is still, as a whole, right, beyond the counties, is present, right? But you can't say exactly to which extent it would play, right, to be say in the broader, together with the broader forces we're agitating in the first place in the land. Northern Estonia, as we were saying before, was conquered instead by the Danish Crusaders, led by King Valdemar II, who arrived in 1219 on the site of the Estonian town of Lindanisse, that is today's Tallinn, at the Latin Revelia, Estonian Revala, the adjacent ancient Estonian county. And the Danish defeated the Estonians at the Battle of Lindanisse. That is very important, say, in Danish history and folklore, because of the legend of the appearance of the Dannebrog, what would become the national flag of Denmark, falling from the sky during the battle, as essentially a rally point to counterattack the Estonians that are told to have attacked from 5 different directions, catching the Danish by surprise, and actually succeeding in breaking them. And it would be the Western Slavic Wendish vassals of the Danes who managed to hold the entire line, right, giving time to the Danes to counterattack and make a massacre out of the Estonians. It tells you how bitterly fought such a battle really is. In the losses were several thousand, according to maybe too many counted from the Estonian side. The Danish ones were definitely heavy, albeit unknown explicitly. And the reason why Denmark attacked Estonia, this northern part, was, say, double in nature. First of all, the Estonians, as we've seen, weren't just quietly living their own home. These areas had been continuing piratic practice. They had been harassing also the southern Baltic shores, where, as we've seen, for example, also the Vends inhabited, that were now subjects to the Danes. So Denmark was becoming a strong commercial power at the time, and allowing the Estonians or whomever to keep harassing the ports of the Baltic, trying to terrorize the settlers, the colonists, etc., even if it was understood in a sort of counter-offensive, defensive way, was intolerable, right? On the other hand, you had the opportunity of, in fact, conquering directly more land, stopping these troubles, and getting, more power overall, locally exploiting the resources, the natives, etc. Right. So the Danish had been also, at this point, were the strongest of the Scandinavian kingdoms, like just throughout the entire Middle Ages, and they were also some of the most westernized. They had ingrained earlier that sense of monarchy, which in fact had kicked in, together with also all the social political consequences of that, the development of a knightly class, Christianity. I made a video about the medieval Denmark, right? We will have to keep talking about it, especially for the Viking era that we neglected a bit. But definitely that kind of conquering Danish spirit showed during the previous centuries now was reversed at the consolidation of Western powers against this softer Eastern Bowels with dramatic consequences, to say the least. And this occupation would last, in fact, for centuries. The Estonians of Harja would start, so that is in the immediate hinterland of Revala, right? So the most important center of the Danish Duchy of Estonia, rose up in 1343 in the aforementioned St. George's Night uprising, and that would engulf the country for 2 years. Right, it was an incredibly violent occurrence because essentially it started again on the day of St. George, exactly as an offense to the Christians, right? Because of the pagan background of Estonians that literally began to exterminate everybody, women, children. As long as they were German, they had to die, right? And at some point there was a negotiation between the two sides, because this rebellion was surely challenging, but hardly, let's say, close to dislodge the German Scandinavian presence there. We're talking Germans here because not just was plenty of German colonists, but because, as we've seen in the 14th century, Denmark was basically hijacked by German knights, right? At some point, some that would even rule the country. That was undergoing a crisis in general, and so this is also why Danish Estonia rebels, because of course the ties with the fatherland had been the fatherland, of course, of Denmark had been loosened in the first place, and during this negotiation with the local bailiffs, because also, as we'll see now, the Livonian order had affirmed itself there. So this was a branch of an autonomous branch of the Teutonic one, but we will look at this better now. Negotiated with some Estonian chieftains. They're called kings in the sources, but of course it's meant the Latin way, the classical way. Some chieftains that went there. There were 4, right? In fact, this meeting is known as one of the 4 kings, but the retinues. They arrived in this castle, and they negotiated with the Livonian authorities for a sort of ceasefire. And the Livonian representative asked them, why did you kill innocent people, right? Just even say civilians, and they answered him that basically even a 2-foot tall German was enough as such, right, not to be massacred, right? And that was the password, right? As long as they were German, they had to die. That's the level of hatred that existed among the locals against the occupants, and there was essentially it was a trap for the kings, because while they were still in the castle, slaughtered together with their entire retinues, because the Livonian authorities fake to say, okay, well, let's make peace, we will not be prosecuted, everything is fine. Then, after having given their word, actually they killed them all. And the war went on for, again, a substantial amount of time. There were 2 battles in which the Estonians were defeated by the preponderant Teutonic forces. By the way, had flowed also just through the Baltic. It was easier, right, to contact, right, to move troops and concentrating them from the outer side than in the hinterland. And on both occasions, the Estonians were essentially taking refuge into swamps, either entrenching in them, but being too small against the preponderant Teutonic forces, or retreating to them. In any case, it was a pure bath of blood, and the few who survived are said to have still tried, even if everything was lost and everything was destroyed. So you have this moral shock that normally kills you, just morally speaking, even if you don't have even a wound. Kept trying to launch terrorist attack, trying to kill Germans, and were massacred, of course, so the repression was as brutal as you can imagine. Actually, this fits if you consider the years that the context of the video made yesterday about the Jacquerie, the 1381 English revolt, the Hussites, because it's part of all these mid-14th century crisis consequences that had many social implications aside just from your ethnic ones, but they were of course all mixed politically. So the most important consequence of this revolt, which is, as we were saying yesterday, just yet another one without exceptions, in which of course the peasantry went down, right? They lost, all these rebels lost everywhere in Europe. This is very interesting. In other words, civilization prevailed, but since the Livonians had also been called to repress, say, with their forces this revolt, and Denmark as a kingdom was not really able to intervene more directly, and was heavily indebted, the Danish king essentially sold the dominions in Estonia, essentially Hungary and Vironia, for 10,000 marks to the Livonian order. This continued essentially the same regime that existed before, Germans before and Germans afterwards, plus, however, Swedish and Danish minority. This is important. The Swedish coastal settlement is somehow overlooked, right? The first written mention of Estonian Swedes come from the end of the 13th century in the laws of the town of Haapsalu, so in the west coast of Estonia, right in the area of the aforementioned straits with Ösel, and that's obvious. Like even just considering the geographical proximity with Sweden, is a seat of the Jasa Sea. It was an important center, and the Estonian Swedes are one of the earliest known minorities in Estonia as well. They have been thus called coastal Swedes, rannarootslaset, in Estonian. Interestingly enough, you see here the root word rot, which has to do with Ross, with the Rus, right? So the Varangians, the sense that the Swedes were, at least as we think, the rowers, etymologically speaking. We have, however, uncertainties about the definition of this Estonian Swedes specifically, because according to their settlement area of Ruunu, that is, as we were saying before, one of these islands in the Gulf of Riga, in the Baltic, the Swedes were known as "you Swedes" as well. They themselves used the expression "Ibfolke," that is island people, right? Ibfolke, and called their homeland Iboland as a consequence, right? And this would also remain as essentially the Estonian Swedish name for the historically Swedish-speaking areas and towns of at least northern and western Estonia, which naturally were also the most important. Now, the ancient areas of Swedish settlement in Estonia were the aforementioned Ruunu, Juma Island as the second largest island in Estonia, also part of the West Estonian archipelago. So with western coast and smaller islands such as Vormsi, Noarootsi, Suslepa, Riguldi, Osmusar, the northwest coast of the Arju district, so all these other localities of Nova, Viterpalu, Kurkse, the Parki Islands and Peninsula, Naisar Island, just of the north, the Dutch of Estonia, near Tallinn, right, just to be clear, Reval. The towns with a significant percentage of Swedish population were, in fact, Haapsalu and Tallinn. It's also, in fact, the most important ones in the first place, as you can imagine. In earlier times, the Swedes also lived on the coasts of Saaremaa, right? This is interesting. The southern part of Läänemaa, the eastern part of Hiiumaa County, the western part of Virumaa. They were somehow scattered always along a coastal line. What is fascinating about Saaremaa especially is that it was still Valdemar II who tried to conquer this from the Osalians, defeated them. At this would eventually, when the Danish forces left, they would essentially rise up again. They would even take a hostage the bishop of the diocese that had been established there during the expedition, because of course these expeditions lasted so long, and then these forces had to come back to Denmark. It was also, even more distant than, of course, Sweden. So colonists had poured in even autonomously and had even just joined. Like, of course, this was an ethnic mix since ever, right? In any case, the local autonomies of the natives were basically crushed, like hammered down just by destroying fortresses and or creating new ones, or seizing first the ones of the enemy, in a relentless struggle, again characterized by an unspeakable amount of brutality, but also with great success. With the Crusaders' conquest, Estonia became Terra Mariana, so the Virgin's land. This is interesting, echoing Tacitus' statement, like the Estonians were essentially still venerating the Great Mother as opposed to the to other populations more Uranianly oriented, right? Like the Germans and the Romans. Well, of course, there was always a mixed degree, right? The Estonians surely did worship, Apollonian deities to a degree. We know about the Osalians, by the way, that they also essentially have venerated Thor, like they were into Norse religion, right? So of course this is just the declension of the same original in common Indo-European and more broadly universal belief. So surely it was a land that didn't leave us, let's say, a particular amount of information about this process, but surely had undergone a complex path, morally, religiously. People that had always been under threat, we see from their equipment, they were again particularly like into hand-to-hand combat in many ways. Like they had very few armor comparatively. Even the Lithuanians had a much richer panoply, for example. The Estonians, we were saying before, were just mostly about quick, immediate, brutal, bloody clashes among infantry, and hopefully, that would just hopefully be hopefully resolutive. But that, given the fragmentation of the country and eventually the defeat right at the hand of the Crusaders was not successful. As we've seen in 1227, the Sword Brethren conquered the last indigenous stronghold of the Estonian island of Saaremaa. Because here, as we've seen, there was a cooperation between the various German, Danish, Swedish missions, and that had been the most dangerous place, because it could launch counteroffensive, it could close the Gulf of Riga in some way, and it was also apparently the most warlike, the ones to be mostly feared, as we remember from the sagas, for example. So after the conquest was accomplished, all the remaining local pagans in Estonia were ostensibly Christianized. So the Terra Mariana as an ecclesiastical state was established, and the conquerors exercised control through the network of strategically located castles, mostly on the coastline. It was, again, what you mostly need to control, because that's where the rivers flow to, and, generally speaking, the hinterland, as we've seen, is a nightmare, but there were actually many many settlements in the hinterland as well that were fortified. They were scattered all over, right? If you went further south, you reach Riga, right? So it was all an interconnection made by, as we've seen, colonists, traders, knights, right? Were installed also for the local defense of the various castles, in very often quite dangerous situations, because guerrilla was out there anyway, and you couldn't quite simply control this place so far away from everything, right? Everything could happen. The territory, as we've seen then, was divided between the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Order, that essentially extended on what had been the Danish-controlled area. Then the bishopric of Dorpat, that we remember before, that was very powerful indeed as an ecclesiastical signatory, and the one of Öselvik. Right. The northern part of the country, and more specifically Arjuma and Viruma, Harrien und Virland in German, was a nominal possession of Denmark until as we've seen, the concession in 1346 to the Livonian Order. Tallinn Rebel was given the Lübeck rights in 1248, so much so that the center joined the Hanseatic League. Lübeck was the capital. The capital is a big word because it was a league, in fact, but say it was the founding city, and also the most powerful one. So connecting these coasts again to a florid trade, made a video about the flow of Hanseatic goods during the 14th century specifically, and it was on the rise at that point, of course. And joined the Hanseatic League at the end of the 13th century. In 1343, the people of northern Estonia and Saaremaa, the Ösel island, started a rebellion, the aforementioned St. George's Night Uprising. Right, it was against the German-speaking landlords, and the uprising was put down. 4 elected Estonian kings were killed in Paide, as we were saying before, during the peace negotiations in the first year. And this had broken out in Saaremaa as well, where the local leader was hanged in 1344, by the way. There were some troubles towards the end of the Middle Ages, continuing local rebellions, but also the Muscovite invasions of 1481 and 1558. The Low German-speaking Upper Estate continued throughout all this time to rule the country, right? So that by the end of the medieval millennium, such Baltic Germans had fundamentally become the governing elite in Estonia. As we've seen, this had been going on also in Finland, where of course there were more Swedes, but also the Germans had substantial power there due to the answer to the greater, importance, demographic, agricultural power of Germany as a whole, right, with lots of colonists coming from the country, etc. Talking about traders, bourgeois, landowners, there was all a system of manorial estates. Admittedly, the country didn't have a lot of resources overall, but certain centers would be richer, of course, and still there was land, there were people working on it. So for, say, those who could collectively control this land, it was possible to send somebody there and make it a profit consistently, and that's the reason why they were there in the first place. So this is the picture at the end of the Middle Ages in a country that definitely wasn't, let's say, so protagonistic in, as we've seen, say, Finland had, for example, more complex history to some degree. Like things had gone pretty much in the same way, and the issue, if anything, was also the largest territory, right? The fact that Estonia did have an interland with the Rus, with the Lithuanians close, right? So they were somehow compressed. They were the last at the top in the north, and as such they also had less resources. Finland was much more complicated, and it was also more complicated to prevent infiltrations from the east, for example, from the Rus, from Novgorod. Estonia was relatively easier to defend, right, and also relatively less convenient, right, for anybody from the interland to try to seize from the Germans, if not by triggering some greater mess than, say, operating in Karelia, right, that was beyond even, say, what the Swedes thought was the eastern frontier in many ways. So we're talking again about wild lands, but some are more framed within other more developed ones, so it's definitely the southern you go, to a degree, that the tour that is. We've seen Lithuania in other videos and how it's, developed politically together with the union with Poland, for example. The general, say, play on international scene. Definitely very different countries, but still, I think Estonia is interesting to look at, exactly for this reason, because it's a sort of sheltered reality that suffered a substantial shock, right, from the conquest, but also remained like as a sort of power, say, isolated, but still functional, at least for those who were controlling it. And we will surely talk about it in the future as well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.